As Madagascar continues its political transition after the ouster of the previous government, it's strengthening cooperation with Russia. Moscow is supplying military equipment to the Indian Ocean nation and has sent a delegation to train armed forces in its use.
A Russian military aircraft landed in Antananarivo and rolled its cargo into hangars before most of Madagascar even knew what had happened. Hours later, the presidency confirmed it. Weapons delivered, Russian trainers on the ground, training beginning near the capital. To the outside world, it looked like routine military cooperation, but inside Western embassies, phones started ringing, analysts started whispering, and a quiet panic set in. Because this was not just a shipment of rifles, Madagascar had spent 60 years inside a French-American security system where Paris trained its officers, and Washington decided what weapons it could buy. That system was never meant to make the island strong. It was meant to keep it manageable. So why would Madagascar suddenly invite Russia to reshape its army? What exactly did Moscow offer that the West never would? And why does this quiet landing threaten to rewrite the balance of power in Africa? Let's find out. For decades, Madagascar's army existed inside a cage that most people never saw, because it was built to look like a partnership. After independence, France did not leave the island with a sovereign military. It left behind a structure designed to protect French commercial routes, plantations, and political leverage across the Indian Ocean. Training missions were presented as generous assistance, but they quietly filtered who could rise through the ranks, selecting officers who spoke the strategic language of Paris and internalized its priorities. The goal was never to create a Malagasy army capable of independent defense. The goal was to create an army that functioned well enough to keep order, but never well enough to challenge foreign influence. When the United States joined through security cooperation, it did not dismantle this system. It perfected it. Procurement rules were introduced that restricted what weapons Madagascar could buy and from whom, ensuring that every serious military capability required Western approval. Counterinsurgency programs brought in surveillance equipment and training that looked modern on paper, but locked the army into Western doctrine and logistics chains. Even spare parts became political tools. A president who drifted too far from Western expectations would suddenly find that maintenance contracts were delayed, training programs paused, and funding quietly frozen. No tanks needed to roll through Antananarivo. Pressure was applied invisibly, through paperwork. This is how military dependence works. It is clean, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. An army that cannot repair its own vehicles, cannot standardize its ammunition, and cannot train its own commanders without foreign instructors is not a national institution. It is a subcontractor. Madagascar's soldiers wore national uniforms, but the real authority over their future sat in Paris and Washington, not in Antananarivo. The consequences were not abstract. When piracy surged in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar could not secure its own coastline without foreign naval assistance. When instability spread across East and Southern Africa, Malagasy commanders were forced to wait for Western approval before modernizing their forces. Even internal security crises became moments of vulnerability because the state knew that acting outside Western expectations risked losing access to the very systems that kept its army functional. Over time, this dependence became normalized. Politicians were taught to believe that sovereignty meant speeches at the United Nations, not control over supply chains and doctrine. Officers were trained to think that professionalism meant alignment with Western priorities, not alignment with Malagasy national interests. The cage was not guarded by soldiers. It was guarded by ideas, contracts, and quiet institutional habits. By the early 2000s, this model was already cracking. Western security cooperation had not delivered stability anywhere in Africa. From Libya to the Sahel, the same pattern repeated. More training, more funding, more bases, and less security. Madagascar watched this closely. It saw that Western partnership did not build strong states. It built compliant ones. And once that realization took hold, the question was no longer whether Madagascar would leave the cage, but how it would escape it, and who would help it do so. Madagascar did not wake up one morning and decide to trust Russia. The shift began thousands of kilometers away. in a region that most Malagasy citizens had never visited but could no longer ignore, the Sahel. When Mali expelled French troops in 2022, Western governments predicted disaster. When Burkina Faso followed, the warnings grew louder. When Niger joined them, analysts spoke openly about collapse. Yet from Antananarivo, the collapse never came. What arrived instead was something far more dangerous to Western influence: independence. Mali's army did not fall apart after France left. It stopped waiting for permission. Burkina Faso did not descend into chaos after rejecting Western security cooperation. It reorganized its command structure and expanded its operational capacity. Niger did not become isolated after tearing up its military agreements. It diversified its partners and rebuilt its supply chains. The common thread was not ideology, it was mechanics. Those countries could suddenly buy weapons without veto, train officers without ideological screening, and fight insurgents without being threatened with sanctions. Western partnership had never allowed that. Madagascar's security planners studied this carefully. They noticed that Russian cooperation did not come with governance lectures, political conditions, or procurement restrictions. It came with equipment, trainers, and a doctrine that treated African states as strategic actors rather than probation cases. For a country that had spent 6 decades being managed rather than respected, that difference was decisive. The Sahel had revealed something the West tried to hide. Security dependence was not protection, it was paralysis. The Indian Ocean context made this lesson even sharper. Madagascar sits on shipping lanes that connect Africa to Asia, near Mozambique's gas corridor, and within reach of some of the world's most valuable mineral routes. Yet its army was still being treated as a junior auxiliary force, incapable of defending those interests without foreign supervision. Watching the Sahel break free showed Antananarivo that remaining inside the Western security system meant remaining strategically irrelevant. Behind closed doors, the conversation changed. Malagasy officials stopped asking how to reform Western cooperation and started asking how to replace it. They wanted a partner who would transfer capacity, not control. A supplier who would build logistics and training ecosystems instead of political dependency. A doctrine that taught territorial defense and state survival rather than donor compliance. Russia fit that profile. When preliminary contacts began, they were not symbolic. They were technical. What calibers could be standardized? How quickly could logistics chains be unified? What maintenance training would be required to eliminate spare parts dependency? How could officer education be reshaped around Malagasy's strategic priorities rather than Western templates? These were the questions that mattered, because they determined whether Madagascar would remain a client state or become a sovereign one. By the time the Russian delegation finally arrived in Antananarivo, the decision had already been made. The Sahel had shown the exit door. Madagascar had chosen to walk through it. But that raised the most important question of all. What exactly was Russia bringing that would make this break from the West irreversible? When the Russian aircraft touched down, the headlines fixated on multi-caliber precision rifles, as if the future of Madagascar's sovereignty could be reduced to a few crates of weapons. But the rifles were never the point. They were only the visible edge of something far larger and far more consequential. A complete military system designed to make Madagascar operationally independent for the first time since independence. Russia did not arrive with a shopping list. It arrived with a blueprint. The first element was standardization. Western security cooperation had deliberately fragmented Madagascar's arsenal, scattering incompatible weapons systems across different calibers and suppliers so that nothing could function without constant foreign approval. Russian planners reversed that logic. They mapped every unit, every depot, every transport route, and began collapsing the chaos into a unified structure. Standardized ammunition meant supply predictability. Unified platforms meant maintenance could be done locally. Logistics chains were rebuilt so that spare parts would no longer arrive as political favors, but as routine technical flows controlled by Malagasy officers. The second element was maintenance of sovereignty. For decades, Madagascar could operate equipment only as long as Western contractors were willing to service it. The moment a government stepped out of line, repairs slowed, training was reviewed, and capability quietly collapsed. Russian trainers targeted that weakness directly. Malagasy technicians were trained not just to use equipment, but to rebuild it, diagnose failures, and manufacture basic components locally. Workshops were turned into strategic assets. Knowledge replaced dependency. The third element was doctrine. Western training had taught Malagasy officers to think in donor language. Stability operations, capacity building, and counterinsurgency framed around foreign priorities. Russian doctrine reframed everything around Malagasy survival. Territorial defense, internal cohesion, maritime security, and state continuity became the organizing principles. This was not a change of terminology. It was a change of identity. The army stopped seeing itself as a subcontractor and started seeing itself as the shield of the nation. Finally came the command culture. Western programs rewarded officers who were fluent in foreign languages. Russian training rewarded officers who could integrate logistics, intelligence, and operations into a coherent national strategy. Promotions were no longer shaped by who had studied in Paris or Washington, but by who could build resilient Malagasy capability. This is why the phrase, "Russia will ensure the formation of Madagascar's army," suddenly made sense. Formation did not mean building a force for Moscow. It meant building a force that no longer needed Paris or Washington to survive. And once that formation began, the old levers stopped working. Sanctions lost their threat. Aid conditionality lost its bite. Political pressure lost its teeth because the army no longer depended on Western approval to function. But all of this technical change still had to become a political reality. A sovereign military only matters if it controls the center of power. So, where was this transformation being anchored, and why did it make Western embassies far more nervous than any shipment of rifles ever could? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The real center of gravity was never the weapons depots or the training fields in the countryside. It was Antananarivo itself. Every state ultimately survives or collapses in its capital, and the units stationed around the city are not just soldiers. They are the political spine of the nation. Whoever shapes their worldview determines whether a government stands under pressure or disintegrates when foreign leverage is applied. That is why the location of the Russian training mattered more than the equipment. Western security cooperation had always focused on cultivating influence at the top, embedding advisors in ministries and elite units to ensure that political decisions aligned with foreign expectations. Officers who trained in Paris and Washington returned not just with skills, but with a sense of legitimacy tied to Western approval. In moments of crisis, that loyalty decided everything. Presidents who resisted Western pressure found their own security apparatus hesitating, uncertain, quietly waiting for signals from abroad. Russian trainers reversed that dynamic. They began working with the units responsible for guarding the state itself, not to extract influence, but to rewire how those soldiers understood their role. Training was no longer framed as supporting partners or upholding international norms. It was framed as defending Malagasy territory, protecting maritime routes, securing critical infrastructure, and ensuring the continuity of the state under any conditions. The message was simple and powerful. Your legitimacy comes from your nation, not from foreign capitals. This shift reshaped the political psychology of the army. Officers stopped measuring professionalism by Western certification and started measuring it by operational readiness and national resilience. Decision-making moved inward. Loyalty moved home. For Western embassies, this was a nightmare scenario. Their influence had never rested on force alone. It rested on the belief that they could apply pressure through the military when politics became inconvenient. Training missions were leveraged. Arms contracts were leveraged. Spare parts were leveraged. Once those levers were removed, their entire crisis management playbook collapsed. That is why a quiet training mission felt more dangerous than a noisy arms deal. Weapons can be sanctioned. Trainers can be criticized. But a transformed command culture cannot be reversed. Madagascar's political future began to shift the moment its capital guarding units stopped looking outward for approval and started looking inward for authority. At that moment, the state stopped being a client and started becoming a sovereign actor. This was not a symbolic change. It had immediate consequences. Decisions that once required Western consultation could now be made in Antananarivo. Strategic planning that once waited for donor alignment could now be driven by Malagasy priorities. For the first time since independence, the country could imagine a future in which its survival did not depend on foreign permission. And this is why Western governments were suddenly anxious, not angry. They understood exactly what they were losing. But if military dependence was the last lever of control, what happens when that lever breaks? And how does that loss ripple across Africa's wider geopolitical landscape? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The moment Madagascar's military dependence began to collapse, something far larger than a bilateral partnership started to unravel. For decades, Western power in Africa had rested on a simple but devastatingly effective formula. Control the security architecture, and you control the politics. Weapons supply determined loyalty. Training pipelines shaped ideology. Spare parts decided whether a president survived a crisis or fell under pressure. It was clean, legal, and almost invisible, which is why it worked for so long. Madagascar's shift exposed the fragility of that model. Once Russia replaced Western suppliers, the old pressure tools stopped functioning. Threatening to suspend training no longer mattered when Malagasy officers were learning from Russian instructors. Warning about sanctions lost its sting when the army no longer depended on Western spare parts. Even diplomatic isolation became hollow, because security is the foundation of all sovereignty, and Madagascar was now building that foundation outside Western control. This is why Western reactions sounded confused rather than confident. They spoke about concerns, standards, and values, but none of those words addressed the real problem. They were losing the ability to shape outcomes. For the first time since independence, Madagascar could decide its security policy without asking for permission. That single change rewired every other policy area, from energy development to mineral licensing to maritime control. Across Africa, governments were watching closely. The Sahel had already shown that Western security dominance could be broken. Madagascar now proved that this was not a landlocked phenomenon. The Indian Ocean was opening as a new front in Africa's security realignment, connecting East Africa, Southern Africa, and the wider BRICS space into a single strategic theater. What looked like a local training mission was becoming a continental signal. The era of military dependency was ending. The West understood the stakes. If Madagascar succeeded, it would become a model. Not because it loved Russia, but because it had solved a problem every African state faced: how to escape security blackmail. And once that problem is solved, the rest of the geopolitical architecture begins to collapse. Currencies stop being weapons, aid stops being leveraged, regime change stops being cheap. This is why a few crates of weapons felt like a geopolitical earthquake. They were not shaking the ground in Antananarivo. They were shaking the foundations of Western power in Africa. And yet, this was not a Russian takeover story. It was an African strategy story. Madagascar was not surrendering its future to Moscow. It was using Moscow to dismantle a system that had kept it weak for 60 years. Russia was not the master, it was a tool. That distinction matters because it explains why this shift will not stop with Madagascar. As more African states realize that security sovereignty is the gateway to real independence, they will follow the same path, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. And that raises the final, unavoidable question. If Africa is reclaiming its military power, what will it choose to reclaim next? What Madagascar has done does not end with Madagascar. It opens a chain reaction that is already moving across the continent, because once security dependence collapses, every other form of dependence becomes optional. Military sovereignty is not just about rifles and training. It is the keystone that holds the entire post-colonial power structure together. Remove it, and the architecture of control starts to fall apart piece by piece. Across Africa, the same pattern is emerging. Countries that break Western military dependence suddenly discover they can renegotiate mining contracts without fear of retaliation. They can challenge unfair currency systems without worrying that their own armies will be turned against them through pressure and blackmail. They can build energy infrastructure without being threatened with standards and compliance reviews designed to delay projects indefinitely. Madagascar's decision tells every African capital that this future is no longer theoretical. It is achievable. In the Indian Ocean, this matters more than almost anywhere else. Control of maritime security determines who benefits from shipping, undersea cables, and offshore energy. For decades, Western navies treated the region as their private highway, while African states remained spectators to their own strategic environment. A Malagasy army that can defend its coastline and its interests changes that balance. It turns the island from a managed territory into a strategic actor, able to shape trade, security, and diplomacy on its own terms. This is why the sentence, "Russia will ensure the formation of Madagascar's army," resonated so deeply. It was not describing a Russian takeover. It was describing the end of Western authorship over African power. Formation now means African design, African priorities, and African control, using Russia as a strategic partner rather than a political master. That is the difference between substitution and sovereignty, and that difference is contagious. Once one country proves that military independence is possible, the psychological barrier breaks everywhere else. Leaders stop asking whether they are allowed to be sovereign and start asking how to become sovereign. Officers stop measuring success by Western approval and start measuring it by national resilience. Citizens stop seeing foreign bases as protection and start seeing them as symptoms of weakness. This is how empires actually lose power. Not through defeat on a battlefield, but through the quiet collapse of the systems that made obedience normal. Madagascar has taken the first step in the Indian Ocean theater of Africa's security revolution. It has shown that the old order can be dismantled without war, simply by replacing dependence with capacity and fear with competence. And that leaves the final unavoidable question hanging over the continent. If Africa has reclaimed its right to defend itself, what will it reclaim next when it realizes that security was only the beginning? Let us know in the comments section. Is the West going to do something about it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.